Plug.
Power Rangers is one of those franchises that almost everybody has experienced at some point in their life. Even if you weren't a die-hard fan, you've probably watched at least one episode before school, while eating cereal that had enough sugar to legally qualify as a controlled substance. It was just one of those shows that every kid somehow stumbled into. You turn on the TV, see five teenagers doing backflips and matching spandex, and somehow 20 minutes later, a giant robot was beating the brakes off a monster that looked like somebody's failed biology project. Now, if you ask different Power Ranger fans what the best season is, you're probably going to get a bunch of different answers. Some people swear by Mighty Morphin because it's the original. Others will tell you Time Force is the greatest thing ever put on television. SPD has its fans. Dino Thunder has people raving about it. The Power Rangers community is surprisingly passionate, considering we're all arguing over a show that regularly solved problems by kicking them really hard. But today I'm here to tell you why every single one of those people is wrong. Because Mystic Force is the best season of Power Rangers. Now, before half the comic section starts typing, "Bro has never seen RPM" at Mach 5, hear me out. I know Mystic Force isn't usually the first season people bring up. In fact, for years, it almost felt like the middle child of the franchise. It wasn't the nostalgic original that everybody grew up with, and it wasn't one of the darker seasons that people constantly praise online. It kind of just existed. Which is funny because after going back and watching it as an adult, I genuinely think it did some things better than almost every other season in the franchise. And maybe that's because Mystic Force was willing to be weird. Power Rangers has always been ridiculous. That's part of the charm. You're watching colorful superheroes fight rubber monsters while explosions happen every 12 seconds. Realism left the building the moment somebody decided dinosaurs and ninjas should solve world-ending threats. But Mystic Force took one look at science fiction and said, "Nah, we're doing wizards. Not scientists, not secret governments, not alien technology, literal magic." The Rangers don't morph because of advanced technology. They morph because they're basically Hogwarts students with better cardio. Their headquarters isn't some underground military bunker filled with computers. It's a magical forest connected to an enchanted root system, and somehow that's one of the least insane things that happens in the show. Looking back, it feels like somebody pitched the series by saying, "What if Harry Potter had Megazords?" And instead of laughing them out of the room, everybody just nodded and started writing. And somehow, it worked. What makes Mystic Force stand out isn't just that it uses magic instead of technology, it's that the entire world commits to the idea. Every season has its own gimmick, but Mystic Force actually builds an entire fantasy setting around its premise. There are magical creatures, ancient prophecies, mythical kingdoms, enchanted weapons, vampires, werewolves, dragons, and enough fantasy lore to make a Dungeons and Dragon player start taking notes. It still feels less like a typical Power Rangers season and more like somebody accidentally dropped Power Rangers into Lord of the Rings. Except Gandalf can apparently summon a Megazord. The older I get, the more I appreciate that commitment. The show doesn't constantly stop to explain why magic exists or why nobody seems particularly shocked by giant monsters attacking the city every Tuesday. It just throws you into the world and says, figure it out. Somehow that confidence makes everything easier to accept. And honestly, that's something I think modern franchises could learn from. Sometimes the audience doesn't need 15 minutes of exposition explaining every little detail. Sometimes it's okay to just have a giant phoenix robot punch a demon in the face and trust that the viewers are having too much fun to ask questions. But while the fantasy setting is what got my attention, it's not exactly why I think Mystic Force is the best. Because underneath all the spells and magical nonsense is something I think Power Rangers has always been at its best when it gets right. Its characters. And that's where Mystic Force really starts to shine. One thing I don't think Power Rangers gets enough credit for is how important the cast is. I know that sounds obvious because, well, of course, the characters matter. But if you watch enough Power Rangers seasons, you start realizing that some teams are remembered more because of their actual suits than the actual people wearing them. There are entire seasons where I can perfectly describe the Megazord but couldn't tell you the Blue Ranger's name if my life depended on it. Mystic Force isn't one of those seasons. The first thing I noticed when I rewatched it was how naturally the Rangers bounce off each other. They don't feel like five random people who happen to be standing in the same parking lot when Destiny showed up. They actually feel like a group of friends that slowly grows together over the course of the series. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons the season still works almost 20 years later. Let's start with Nick, because, yeah, we have to. Nick catches a lot of heat from fans, and honestly, I get it. He's not the loudest Red Ranger, he isn't constantly cracking jokes, and he definitely spends a good chunk of the series acting like somebody who just found out the Wi-Fi is down forever. But I actually think that works for the story they're trying to tell. Unlike a lot of Red Rangers who immediately jump into being the fearless leader, Nick spends a lot of the show questioning himself. He's stubborn, sarcastic, and honestly kinda wants nothing to do with being the chosen hero. If somebody walked up to me and said, "Hey, you're secretly a wizard and the fate of the world depends on you," my first response probably wouldn't be awesome. It'd probably be, "Can I finish my shift first?" Nick feels like an actual person getting dragged into something way bigger than himself. And because of that, watching him slowly grow into the leader feels earned instead of automatic. Then there's Xander. I swear every friend group has a Xander. He's confident, maybe a little too confident. He's always trying to flirt, always trying to lighten the mood, and somehow manages to fall upwards on a regular basis. Half the things he says make you question how he survived this long, but he's also incredibly loyal when it actually matters. He's basically the human version of task failed successfully. Then you've got Chip, who might honestly be my favorite ranger on the team. This man is every fantasy nerd who ever dreamed of living inside their favorite book. While everyone else is trying to survive, Chip has just decided that magic is real. He treats every monster attack like he's been invited to Comic Con. Oh my gosh, is that a troll? Brother, it's actively trying to kill you. His enthusiasm is infectious, though. Every team needs somebody who's genuinely happy to be there, and Chip fills that role perfectly. He reminds you that being a superhero would actually be kind of awesome if you ignored the constant threat of death. Vita is another standout because he never feels like she's there just to fill a spot on the team. She's stubborn, independent, and has enough attitude to keep everyone else grounded. She's constantly calling people out when they're being idiots, which in Power Rangers is basically a full-time job. Then there's Madison, who's almost the complete opposite. She's quieter, more reserved, and doesn't always say the most. But when she does, it actually means something. I always appreciate characters like that because not every member of the team needs to be the loudest person in the room. Sometimes having somebody who's calm balances everyone else out. The best part is how all of these personalities actually complement each other. Nobody feels like they're competing for screen time. Everyone has their role, and over time, those relationships start feeling believable. By the middle of the series, I stopped thinking of them as the Red Ranger or the Green Ranger and started thinking of them as actual characters. Then there's Udana. Can we talk about how refreshing it was to have a mentor who actually got involved? Half of the mentors in Power Rangers spend 90% of the season standing behind a computer saying things like, Ranger, you must stop the monster. Thanks, Zordon, we hadn't considered that. Udana actually fights. She leaves the command center. She has her own story. She feels like an important character instead of an objective marker giving out side quests. And then you have Limbo. Without getting too deep into spoiler territory for the 3 people watching this who somehow haven't seen Mystic Force yet, Limbo is one of my favorite characters in the entire franchise. His story has genuine emotional weight. His design is incredible, and every time he shows up, it feels important. That's something Mystic Force does really well in general. Characters matter, not just the Rangers. The mentors matter, the villains even matter. Even supporting characters usually have something going on besides existing to deliver exposition. When the characters are strong, everything else becomes stronger too. The fights mean more because you actually care who's winning. The emotional moments land because you spend enough time with these people to become invested. Even the goofy episodes work because the cast has chemistry. Looking back, I think that's why Mystic Force has aged so well for me. As a kid, I watched it because magic is cool. As an adult, I watch it because the characters carried a story in a way I didn't fully appreciate back then. And honestly, that's not something I can say about every Power Rangers season. But as much as I love the characters, they still aren't my favorite part. Because Mystic Force is something that almost every kid dreams about. It lets its Rangers become dragons. Now, let's talk about what every kid actually cares about: the powers. Because let's be honest, when you're 8 years old, you don't care about character development. You care about one thing: can he turn into something cool? That's literally the entire checklist. Does the suit look awesome? Is the weapon cool? Does the Megazord punch things? Can I convince my mom to buy the toy? If the answer is yes, congratulations, you have successfully created peak fiction for an elementary school student. And that's why I think Mystic Force stuck with me for so long. Powers were just cool. Not grounded, not realistic, just unapologetically cool. Every ranger is essentially a wizard, and instead of making magic feel like some complicated system with 15 different rules, the show just embraces it. They cast spells, summon elemental attacks, and transform using actual incantations. It feels less like they're activating technology and more like they're learning an ancient craft. I love that each ranger's powers actually reflect their personality instead of just giving everybody differently colored laser beams. Nick controls fire, Madison controls water, Vita controls air, Xander controls earth, and Chip controls lightning. They're simple elemental powers, but because the show leans so heavily into the fantasy theme, they feel much more distinct than they probably should. Every fight has a little more personality because everyone approaches combat differently. Then you have the weapons. One thing Power Rangers have always been good at is making weapons that every kid immediately wanted for Christmas. And Mystic Force absolutely delivers. Magic staffs that become swords, crossbows, elemental attacks. It all feels like somebody emptied an entire fantasy RPG inventory into the show. But then, the show starts escalating. Because apparently turning into superhero wizards wasn't enough. Halfway through the series, somebody in the writer's room must have stood up and said, what if, hear me out, they became dragons? And instead of being escorted off of the property, they got promoted. The Mystic Titans are still some of the coolest upgrades in the entire fan base. They're not just stronger forms, they completely change how the Rangers fight. Watching the Rangers transform into giant magical creatures absolutely blew my mind as a kid. Most Power Rangers seasons give you stronger armor. Mystic Force? What if the Red Ranger became an actual dragon? Problem solved. Even now, I still think those transformations are awesome. They're dramatic, they're over the top, they're exactly the kind of thing Power Rangers should be doing. But here's something I think people forget: Power Rangers isn't supposed to be subtle. This is a franchise where teenagers regularly summon skyscraper sized robots to fight monsters, wearing suits while explosions happen in the background for absolutely no reason. Subtlety left this franchise decades ago. Mystic Force understands that. Instead of trying to tone itself down, it keeps asking one question: how do we make this even cooler? Sometimes that answer is dragons, sometimes it's giant phoenixes, sometimes it's magic trains. Power Rangers has never made an idea too ridiculous to try, and I respect that. Then we get to one of my favorite Rangers in the entire franchise, the Solaris Knight. First of all, can we appreciate how unbelievably cool this guy looked? Gold armor, a cape, a sword, a magic lamp. He basically, if Aladdin hit the gym. Seriously, this man walks on the screen looking like he wandered out of an RPG after completing every side quest. And unlike some Six Rangers who take forever to become part of the team, Solaris Knight immediately feels important. His introduction is memorable, his powers are unique, and he brings a completely different energy to the group. Power Rangers has had a lot of Six Rangers over the years. Mystic Force is one of the few seasons where I genuinely look forward to every time the Six Rangers show up. Then there's Legend Mode. Power Rangers has always loved giving the Red Ranger one final upgrade near the end of the series, but Legend Mode might honestly be one of my favorites. The cape alone adds at least 30% more power. That's just science. Every fictional character becomes cooler the moment you give them a cape. Batman, cape. Spawn, cape. Doctor Strange, cape. Mystic Force looked at the Ranger and said, "You know what this man needs? Fabric." And somehow, they were right. Everything about Legend Mode screams final boss energy. The design feels powerful without becoming cluttered, and when Nick finally unlocks it, it actually feels earned, because you've watched him struggle the entire season to become the leader everyone believed he could be. That's another thing Mystic Force does really well. Its upgrades don't feel random. A lot of seasons introduce new powers because the toy aisle needed some refreshing. Mystic Force usually ties those upgrades into the story itself. Characters grow, overcome obstacles, unlock new abilities, and the transformations feel like the payoff to something rather than just the next product on the shelf. Sure, they're still selling toys, it's Power Rangers. Nobody's pretending otherwise, but at least they put in the effort to make those toys feel important. Looking back, I think that's why the powers of Mystic Force still stand out almost 20 years later. They weren't trying to reinvent the Power Rangers, they were trying to make the coolest fantasy adventure they possibly could. And I honestly would like to say, mission accomplished. But cool powers only matter if the people you're fighting are worth using them against. Luckily for Mystic Force, its villains are absolutely crazy. One thing I think separates the really good Power Rangers season from the forgettable ones is the villains. Because let's be honest, Power Rangers has had some interesting bad guys over the years. Sometimes you get an intimidating warlord who's conquered entire galaxies. Other times it's a giant pumpkin with anger issues. It's kind of a coin flip. Mystic Force somehow manages to make both of these ideas work. The biggest reason is that villains actually feel like they're part of the world instead of just showing up every episode to get punched before disappearing into a cloud of sparks. The entire season revolves around the underworld, this ancient magical prison full of monsters that have been sealed away for years. Right from the beginning, there's this feeling that something much bigger is happening behind the scenes. But every time one of the gates open, it isn't just another monster showing up for its weekly paycheck. It feels like another piece of an ancient evil slowly making its way back into the world. That sense of progression is something I think Mystic Force does really well. Instead of every episode feeling disconnected, the villains are constantly moving towards the same goal. They're trying to resurrect the Master, and every success or failure actually changes where the story goes next. It gives the season momentum because you're not just waiting for the next monster fight, you're watching a plan slowly unfold. Then there's Korag. Man, kid me thought this dude was the coolest thing to ever exist. Honestly, adult me still thinks he's kinda awesome too. Everything about him screams final boss. The black armor, the deep voice, the giant sword, the horse, the purple flames. He looks like somebody took every cool fantasy trope imaginable and threw him into one character. If you ask a 12-year-old to design the most intimidating knight possible, you'd probably end up with Korag. The best part is that he isn't just cool because he looks cool, he's actually a threat. So many Power Rangers villains spend half the season losing fights and yelling, "Next time, Rangers!" before teleporting away. Korag shows up, absolutely embarrasses the Rangers, and leaves. There are multiple points early in the series where it generally feels like the Rangers are completely outmatched, and that's something Power Rangers doesn't always do well. If your heroes never struggle, the victories don't mean much. Korag forces them to struggle. He makes mistakes feel costly. Every encounter with him feels important because there's always the possibility that the Rangers are about to lose. And then as the series goes on, you start learning more about who Korag actually is. I won't spoil every detail in case somebody watching this that somehow decides Mystic Force is next on their bin list, but his story ends up adding a surprising amount of emotional weight to the season. He's not just another evil knight standing around looking intimidating. There's an actual tragedy behind the character, and once all the pieces come together, a lot of his actions make way more sense. That's something I appreciate more as an adult than I ever did as a kid. Back then, I was just thinking, whoa, sword. Now I'm sitting there like I'm watching a fantasy drama, wondering how this children's show suddenly has me emotionally invested in a guy wearing 30 pounds of black armor. Then you have Imperius. Now, this guy is interesting because he's the exact opposite of Korag. Where Korag is honorable and straightforward, Imperius is manipulative. He's constantly scheming, lying, and trying to work everyone around him to his advantage. He's the kind of villain that would absolutely remind the teacher they forgot to assign homework if it somehow helped his evil plan. I always like villains that create conflict without simply being stronger than everybody else. Sometimes intelligence is a much bigger threat than brute force, and Imperius proves that several times throughout the series. Of course, we also have the monster designs themselves, and I genuinely think Mystic Force has some of the coolest looking monsters in the franchise. Because they're based on fantasy creatures instead of random household objects, they naturally fit the world. You're fighting gargoyles, undead warriors, demons, trolls, and mythical beasts instead of, I don't know, an evil vacuum cleaner with abandonment issues. The fantasy setting gives the artist so much more room to make interesting designs, and it really shows. Then, looming over all of it is the Master. One thing I like is that the Master isn't constantly showing up every episode yelling at his minions. He's treated like this ancient force that's been locked away for centuries, and everyone fears what happens if he returns. That mystery makes him feel far more intimidating than if he had just been hanging around the villain headquarters every week, drinking evil coffee and complaining about the Rangers. When he finally becomes relevant, it feels earned because the entire season has been building towards that moment. That's another thing Mystic Force nails: escalation. Every victory feels like it matters. Every villain feels like a step towards something bigger. Compare that to some season where it feels like nothing really changes until the final 5 episodes. and the difference becomes pretty obvious. But I think my favorite thing about Mystic Force's villains is that they actually match the tone of the season. This isn't a military sci fi story, it's fantasy. The villains aren't evil corporations or alien generals, they're dark wizards and magical beings that look like they escaped from somebody's D&D campaign after rolling nothing but critical hits. Everything fits together. The world is magical, nothing feels out of place because the season fully commits to its theme. And honestly, I wish more Power Rangers seasons had that level of confidence in their own identity. Because when every part of a season is pulling in the same direction, everything becomes stronger. Which is exactly why, after rewatching Mystic Force as an adult, I realized something. It wasn't just my childhood talking, this season actually holds up. And that's probably the biggest compliment I can give it. After rewatching Mystic Force from beginning to end, I came to a realization that honestly surprised me. I didn't just enjoy it because I watched it as a kid. I enjoyed it because it's actually good. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't one of those videos where I'm going to pretend the season is flawless because that would be ridiculous. Every Power Rangers season had problems, and Mystic Force is no exception. There are definitely episodes that feel like filler, some characters probably could have gotten more development, and there are moments where the dialogue reminds you, oh yeah, this was made for children. Then again, half the Marvel movies have jokes that sound like they were written by somebody who just discovered sarcasm, so I'm willing to cut Mystic Force a little slack. The thing is, none of those flaws ever stopped me from having fun. And honestly, I think that's something we've forgotten how to value. Not every show has to be Breaking Bad. Not every story needs 15 layers of symbolism and an hour-long video essay explaining why the blue curtains actually represent the collapse of modern civilization. Sometimes, a wizard turning into a dragon and punching an evil demon is enough. There's something incredibly refreshing about a show that fully commits to its own insanity without constantly apologizing for it. Mystic Force never feels embarrassed to be Power Rangers. It doesn't try to make everything darker just because that's what the older fans supposedly want. It doesn't constantly wink at the audience like it's afraid people would think it's uncool. It says, we're making a fantasy show where teenagers use magic to summon giant robots. That's about it. And somehow, that confidence makes the whole thing work. Looking back, I think that's why the season has aged better than people give it credit for. The fantasy setting was great, the characters are still likable, and the villains are very memorable. The music still goes so unbelievably hard. Seriously, can we talk about the music for a second? Power Rangers has always had good theme songs, but Mystic Force's opening is one of those songs that immediately activates something in your brains. I don't care how old you are, the song starts playing and suddenly you're 8-year-olds again trying to morph for the TV remote because you were absolutely convinced it might work this time. Don't lie, we all tried it. I know I wasn't the only kid yelling magical source Mystic Force in the living room while accidentally roundhouse kicking the couch. If anything, my parents deserve their own medal for putting up with me. But that's another reason I love this season. It has personality. Every Power Rangers series has its gimmick, but Mystic Force feels like it has its own identity. When you hear SPD, you think police. When somebody says Dino Thunder, you think dinosaurs. When somebody says Ninja Storm, you think, well, ninjas. When somebody says Mystic Force, you immediately think magic. Not because the Rangers occasionally use spells, because the entire season lives and breathes that one concept. Every location, every villain, every weapon. Everything supports the same fantasy atmosphere. That's surprisingly rare, even outside of Power Rangers. A lot of franchises introduce cool ideas but never fully commit to them. Mystic Force commits. It doesn't dip its toes into fantasy, it cannonballs into it. Looking back, I think that's why it's become my favorite season. Not because it's objectively perfect, not because everyone else is wrong, but because it knew exactly what it wanted to be. It wasn't trying to imitate another season. It wasn't chasing trends. It simply asked one question. What if Power Rangers? But wizards? And then it weaved every possible idea out of that concept. By the end of the series, it feels like somebody dumped every fantasy novel they could find into a blender, hit parade, and somehow created one of the most entertaining seasons in the franchise. Now, am I saying everyone has to agree with me? Absolutely not. I already know somebody in the comments is typing a 14-paragraph essay explaining why RPM is actually the greatest season ever made. Another person's writing Time Force clears. Someone else is probably just commenting SPD emergency. And honestly, I love that. Power Rangers is one of those franchises where everybody has their season. The one they watched after school. The ones whose toys they balked their parents to buy. The one whose theme song they still remember word for word 20 years later. For me, that season is Mystic Force. Maybe it's because of the nostalgia, maybe it's the fantasy setting, maybe it's because I've always been a sucker for anything involving magic, giant swords, dragons, and lore. Actually, yeah, it's probably that last one. If you watch literally any other video on this channel, you've probably realized that if something has an unnecessarily complicated backstory, I'm going to spend 3 hours reading about it instead of doing something productive. If a fictional universe has 57 books and a wiki longer than the United States tax code, I'm interested. Mystic Force was basically my gateway drug into fantasy worlds like that, and maybe that's why it still means so much to me today. It was a season that made me realize how much I love fantasy as a genre. So after all these years, after rewatching the fights, the characters, the villains, the music, I can confidently say Mystic Force is still my favorite Power Rangers season. And honestly, I don't think that's changing anytime soon. If you enjoyed this video, let me know what your favorite Power Rangers season is down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious because every fan seems to have a completely different answer. If enough people want it, maybe I'll go back and revisit some of the other seasons to see if they hold up as well as I remember. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Forever